When we read the gospel accounts and we watch the disciples fall all over each other's mistakes, act faithlessly, speak presumptuously, brag atrociously, and take forever and a day to understand even the most basic of concepts, it isn't time for ridicule. It's time for joy, because it's then we come to understand, hey, I could have made that team. That's the bar for discipleship. I could get under that with a camel. Genesis 28, stolen birthright, stolen blessing, well secured. Jacob is being sent to relatives to escape Esau's wrath and to get a bride. And on the way he pulls his donkey over to the side of the road and he sleeps. And he has a dream, a vision, whereby God himself arrives, speaks to him. Only he speaks not as the previous chapters might suggest he would arrive to speak. God arrives not to haul Jacob's sorry, deceiving, cheating, lying, thieving little butt over the coals. The opposite is true. God turns up to recite the promises he'd previously made to Abraham. He doesn't even begin with, look, you're the last person I want to speak to right now, but, nevertheless, I got a job to do. So, anyone reading this narrative and hoping that this little upstart was about to receive his comeuppance is left sorely disappointed. And I'm one of them. I know the story and I still read it, hoping this time the end of the story will change and Jacob will have his much deserved backside leathered. Though, I do freely confess my own gratitude for the multitude of times that God would have been justified in taking a few layers of skin off my butt and didn't. So, just a little insight there into my own hypocritical ways. But over 20 times the Bible refers to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So the God of Abraham, well, that only makes good sense, right? He leaves Ur evidently immediately upon command, and by all demonstrable evidence walks aimlessly but faithfully for decades, waiting on a promise that takes so long that it has to be periodically recited to him. Then he has to wait until Sarah and him are beyond the age of conception in order to conceive and have Isaac. Then he's called to sacrifice the child of promise and aims to do so. And throughout all of this, except for a few minor setbacks, he appears to have handled all of this arguably way better than anyone else who has since heard his story would have been able to do it. So, the God of Abraham fits. It sounds right, it looks right, and it preaches right. The God of Isaac, not so much, but all right. I mean, we don't have too much information on Isaac, but in a book that pulls no punches and spares no blushes, one would have to conclude that by all measurable standards, Isaac was averagely all right. But the God of Jacob, the cheating, lying, deceiving, conning, thieving Jacob, does God have no shame but at all? Doesn't God know that he has a reputation to forge? A reputation that's going to have to survive the ages? A reputation that he's going to ask every child of Eve to stake their eternity on? Doesn't God understand that in order for us to believe on him, he's going to have the proper credentials, going to have to be found at all the right parties. He's going to have his shoulders rubbing against the shoulders of the powerful, the influential, the somebodies, the big hitters. Or if not these people, if he is going to insist on slumming it, doesn't he at least know that he's going to have to draw his fellowship circle a little tighter than Jacob? And at least hang around with the relatively clean living, church attending, Bible reciting, morally upright folk? Or, if not these, could he at least be found among those who acknowledge him? I mean, the only reference we have of Jacob even mentioning God thus far was in the last chapter when he was conning his father Isaac and referred to God as the Lord your God. Not even the Lord my God, not even the Lord our God. The Lord your God. Look, I get it. Pickings are slim when the population of the world is only a fraction of what it is now. Pickings are slim when, as a species, rebellion seems to be our default setting. Pickings are slim when you've already had to flood an entire world, topple a tower, and precision bomb a couple of cities. But Jacob, it really doesn't take long, does it? I mean, we aren't even up to our ankles in Scripture. We're only 28 chapters in before we learn that God, for all his finer qualities, really doesn't know how to keep good company. He did up until now. The commentary on Noah in Genesis 6, Noah was a righteous man, blameless. His commentary's glowing. Lot is spared from Sodom, and even after centuries of reflection on that entire episode, Peter tells us that Lot is regarded as a righteous man. Abraham gets the distinct privilege of being referred to as God's friend 3 times in Scripture. Prior to this, the company God kept was regularly fine. One would be forgiven, just picking up the Bible and reading it, starting at Genesis 1, that after 27 chapters, one would be forgiven for thinking that we need to possess a special standard of holiness or character to be useful to God. All the big hitters thus far have been, by and large, big hitters. If all we knew of Scripture was the previous 27 chapters, we would be reading the story of Jacob, waiting for him to be cast out of a garden, toppled like a tower, flooded or obliterated by fire from the sky. Sitting on the edge of our seats, knowing that this chapter, this is when it'll arrive. Given the opening 27 chapters. Even Jacob's closing statement in this chapter, after he's received the vision from God, after he's heard God's voice, and after he's listened to yet another promise rehearsal, even after this, Jacob's statement has all the hallmarks of arrogance that someone might expect from a spoon-fed, entitled little mama's boy. In verse 20, Jacob says, all right, if God will be with me, and if God will watch over me in this journey and that I'm taking, and if God will give me food to eat, and if God will give me clothes to wear, so that I might return safely to my father's house, then the Lord will be my God. Ooh, lucky, lucky God. God certainly won the lottery with Jacob. Almost feel like say, easy, Jacob, don't sell yourself too short. After all, it's clearly God who's getting the bargain here. God must have been overjoyed to have found such a grateful prize. He must have been waking up early every morning, desperately anxious to jump through all the provisional hoops that Jacob had supplied him. This boy would test the patience of a saint, as we'd say in Glasgow. That's the type of character we're seeing unfold. And it's obviously as clear to God as it is to us that in Jacob, God has his work cut out. And I suppose then that through Jacob, this is the God who shall be revealed to us. Lucky for Jacob. Lucky for us, who are also prone to display our moments of ingratitude. Lucky for us that God isn't afraid of hard work. In John 5:17, when Jesus is being interrogated for doing good on the Sabbath, Jesus says, my Father is always working, and so am I. Later on in Scripture, when it tells us if a man will not work, he should not eat, or when it's informing us that a man who does not provide for his own household is worse than an unbeliever, this type of condemnation arrives because God works, and therefore as God's image bearers, we ought to work too. But when Jesus says, my Father is always working and so am I, one quick glimpse around the place, calculating who we are and who God has to work with, ought to tell us why. No wonder he's always working. It's not like we give him a choice. I spoke with Chris Johnson recently on his podcast. Oh, he's such a good kid. Well, he's as broken as the rest of us, but you know what I mean. He's a good boy. Anyway, I was speaking with him on Matthew chapter 1, and Chris pointed out that the genealogy of Jesus contained a whole list of underachievers, sinners, and castaways. And of course, he's right. But what else would we expect to find? It's not as though we gave God much choice. It's not as though over there, somewhere beyond a different mountain, there was a whole bunch of sinless people that he could have chosen. It's a little like, when someone says, did you know 95% of shark attacks happen in only 4 feet of water? Well, of course they do. That's where all the people are. So, of course, Scripture's list of who God works with is littered with sinners, because what else we got? When Jesus says, I've come to call the sick, our response should have been, good job. Otherwise, it would have been a very short trip for you. You'd have been here about a day and a half. But our response to that is typically, And correctly, typically, he came for the sick. Oh, thank God. At least that puts me in with a chance. When we read the gospel accounts and we watch the disciples fall all over each other's mistakes, act faithlessly, speak presumptuously, brag atrociously, and take forever and a day to understand even the most basic of concepts, it isn't time for ridicule. It's time for joy. Because it's then we come to understand, hey, I could have made that team. That's the bar for discipleship. I could get under that with a camel. Jesus can say to those scallywags, you are those who stood by me in all my trials. So if anything is clear in regard to Genesis 28, it's clear that God has the will, the want, and the time that it takes to turn even entitled reprobates' ship around. So when we look and have a look at this God in chapter 28, a God who appears in a wasteland to a waster, in a desert to a deceiver, in the wilderness to a wild ass of a man, neither of which deserve his presence. But it's in this place, to this person, that God reveals his glory. And I'm not being cruel. I'm not talking out of school. Jacob wakes up and agrees with me. The Lord was in this place for me. So what do we see? Well, among other things, we see that our God will be where he will be, and we won't have anything to say about it. And that he'll be with who he'll be with. And that also should leave us speechless. And that our God will bless whoever he wants to bless. And we won't have a thing to say about it. We have a God who shows no partiality. And within 3 generations here, from Abraham through to Jacob, God proves it right across the scale of human character and human achievement. When we read about Jacob and characters like Jacob, this is our chance to see if God can perform at the highest level. Anyone can play chopsticks, right? Any half-decent God could have handled Abraham. Could he handle Jacob? And yet what we find when it comes to God as we steadily read through Scripture, as he's being slowly revealed to us, that we have a God that can play Mozart, blindfolded, one-handed, in a storm, aboard a rocking ship. So we won't want to live a life that tests the boundaries of God's grace. Grateful children don't do that. We'll seek to live a life pleasing to the one who gave it to us because we know it's pleasing to him. That's where we'll aim. Anyway, happy that when we wake up each morning and look in the mirror at this ever-aging face looking back at us, we'll just be happy that we can look at this life-wearied, storm-beaten face, and that we can look at that face and with full confidence tell him in the mirror, tell her in the mirror, you're never going to believe this, The Lord is in this place. And perhaps even smile as we cast our eyes heavenward and we say to God, after all these years, Father, you still don't know how to keep good company? What a God. What a God. Jealous of anyone for anything? You got to be out of your mind.